The lights are low. Not the kind that blind you, but the kind that soften the edges of a room. A living room after sunset, curtains half drawn. A hotel conference hall moments before the music swells. A kitchen table at midnight, where a laptop glows brighter than the future it promises. This story does not begin with balance sheets or contracts. It begins with hope, quiet, personal, and dangerously sincere. Welcome back to the story of money. Hope, when it is sold, has a particular tone. It does not shout, it leans in. It speaks softly, as if sharing a secret meant only for you. It tells you that the world has changed, that the old paths no longer work, that stability is an illusion reserved for someone else. And then it pauses, just long enough for doubt to creep in, before offering itself as the answer. And if you find yourself drawn into this journey, consider liking and subscribing. It helps keep stories like this alive. Stories about how money moves not just through markets, but through people. Multi-level marketing rarely announces itself as a system. It arrives as a relationship. A message from an old school friend you barely recognize anymore. A coffee invitation framed as catching up. A late-night voice note that starts with an apology for the long message and ends with excitement you can almost feel through the screen. It doesn't say business model, it says opportunity. It doesn't say risk, it says belief. There is something deeply human about the way these empires begin, not in boardrooms, but in conversations. In the shared frustrations of underpaid work. In the silent fear of bills arriving faster than wages. In the creeping sense that no matter how hard you try, the ladder keeps moving. MLMs step into that emotional gap with impeccable timing. They do not need to invent dissatisfaction. They only need to recognize it. Long before social media feeds and live streams, the idea took shape in quieter ways. Traveling salesmen carrying samples from town to town. Housewives selling household goods to neighbors who trusted them more than faceless companies. The logic was simple, almost elegant. People trust people. A recommendation from someone you know feels safer than a slogan printed on a billboard. From that trust, commission structures emerged, then expanded. Sell a product, earn a percentage. Bring someone else in, earn a little more from what they sell. It seemed harmless, even empowering. But something subtle happened as those structures grew. The center of gravity shifted. Selling the product was no longer the most powerful action. Recruiting another seller was. The value of a person inside the system began to outweigh the value of the product itself. This was the first quiet transformation when commerce began leaning more on multiplication than demand. At first, it feels like momentum, growth, energy. Meetings fill with applause and optimism. Training sessions focus less on what is being sold and more on who you are becoming. The product is important, yes, but the real emphasis is on vision, on freedom, on the promise that you are no longer exchanging hours for money, but building something that will outlive your effort. This is where the language changes. You are no longer a salesperson, you are an entrepreneur. No longer an employee, but a business owner. The distinction matters because it reframes responsibility. Success belongs entirely to you. Failure does too. What makes the MLM model so powerful is not deception in the traditional sense. The rules are usually there, written somewhere in dense documents few people read. The numbers add up technically. But the system is experienced emotionally, not mathematically. It is taught through stories, not spreadsheets. Through testimonials that feel close enough to touch. Someone stands on a stage and talks about quitting their job. Someone else posts about paying off debt. Another shares photos from a holiday framed as working from anywhere. These moments are not fabricated in the sense of being fake. They are real outcomes for real people, but they are not representative. And yet they become the lens through which everything else is judged. The early days inside an MLM often feel electric. Messages arrive constantly. Group chats buzz late into the night. There is always another call, another training, another mindset shift that promises clarity. The community becomes a mirror, reflecting back a version of you that feels more confident, more capable, more seen. For many, this is the first time anyone has spoken to them about ambition without judgment. And beneath it all, money begins to move. Small commissions at first, a sense of validation when a notification appears, proof that this might actually work. The system encourages reinvestment into products, into events, into personal development. Each purchase feels like planting a seed. Each expense reframed as an investment in your future self. What is rarely said out loud is that the company profits immediately from participation. Every starter kit, every monthly minimum, every conference ticket. The money flows upward long before it flows outward. The risk, however, travels in the opposite direction. It settles quietly on the shoulders of individuals who have been told they are building businesses, but who do not control pricing, supply, or strategy. This is not accidental, it is structural. Traditional businesses absorb risk centrally. If a product fails, the company loses. In MLMs, unsold inventory lives in homes. Credit card balances tell the real story long before income statements do. The warehouse is decentralized, the losses are private. The narrative remains optimistic. Still, people stay. They stay because leaving feels like giving up not just on a company, but on themselves. When success is framed as mindset, doubt becomes weakness. Questions become negativity. Those who exit are quietly recast as cautionary tales, not of the system, but of insufficient belief. This is where the model deepens, where it stops being merely economic and becomes psychological. The business no longer needs to enforce loyalty. Loyalty enforces itself. Community replaces skepticism. Encouragement masks pressure. The dream is always one breakthrough away, just out of reach but close enough to keep chasing. And as the network grows, something else happens. Saturation, markets fill, relationships strain. The same circle of friends is approached again and again, each time with renewed enthusiasm, each time with diminishing returns. The effort required to achieve the same result increases, but the narrative does not adjust. Instead, it intensifies. The truth is rarely revealed in a single moment. It seeps in gradually, through quiet comparisons, through bank statements checked in private, through the realization that the hours spent building are beginning to resemble unpaid labor. This is the first crack, though many do not recognize it yet, because the story is still unfolding. And the most powerful parts of the MLM empire, the ones that explain how it scales, how it survives criticism, how it transforms belief into revenue, are only just beginning to reveal themselves. Momentum has a sound. It hums softly at first, like electricity behind a wall, barely noticeable until you stop and realize it's everywhere. Inside an expanding MLM network, that hum becomes constant. Notifications, voice notes, live calls scheduled across time zones. The system begins to feel alive, responsive, awake even when you are not. And that feeling is not accidental. It is engineered. As the network grows, the model reveals its next layer, not to everyone at once, but gradually, depending on how deep you go. What started as selling a product now demands something more. Abstract, leadership, duplication, scale. You are encouraged to stop focusing on customers and start focusing on builders. People who will build people who will build people. The product becomes almost symbolic, a prop that legitimizes the structure while attention shifts elsewhere. At this stage, income presentations change tone. Early optimism gives way to charts showing exponential curves. Not earnings, yet potential. If each person recruits just a few others, the math appears irresistible. The numbers climb fast on slides, faster than real life ever will. It looks inevitable, mechanical, almost scientific. But the equations assume frictionless reality, endless markets, infinite trust, relationships immune to fatigue. What is rarely addressed is the human cost of that friction. Every new layer added below you is another relationship that must be nurtured, motivated, managed. Encouragement becomes a daily task. Energy must be projected constantly. If belief falters anywhere in the chain, income trembles above it. The system does not just sell optimism. It requires it as fuel. This is where personal identity begins to fuse with the business. Success is no longer something you do. It becomes who you are. Social media profiles transform subtly. Bios mention leadership. Posts shift from casual updates to motivational framing. Even ordinary moments are repackaged as proof that the system works. A coffee becomes a lesson. A setback becomes a mindset test. The company benefits enormously from this fusion. Marketing costs approach zero when distributors become living advertisements. Every post, every story, every carefully worded caption extends the brand's reach without appearing to do so. It doesn't feel like advertising, it feels like authenticity. And authenticity, when monetized, is extraordinarily powerful. But beneath the surface, the structure tightens. Monthly requirements must be met to remain active. Rank advancements depend on group volume, not just personal sales. You begin to feel responsible not only for your own effort, but for the output of others' people whose lives you cannot control. Their motivation becomes your problem. Their doubt becomes your threat. And so the language sharpens. Training calls emphasize resilience. Leaders speak about pushing through discomfort. They remind you that growth is supposed to feel hard. That resistance means you are close to a breakthrough. The system reinterprets stress as progress, exhaustion as alignment. There is always another layer of effort to unlock the next reward. The economics beneath this are precise. Money flows upward in widening streams. Each purchase made by someone below you sends a fraction of value above, diluted by layers, but multiplied by volume. At scale, this creates astonishing income for those positioned early. Their labor shifts from selling to maintaining belief, hosting calls, sharing stories, reinforcing culture. They become stewards of the narrative. For those lower down, the experience is different. Income, if it comes, is sporadic. Expenses are constant. Travel to events is framed as essential. Missing one feels like falling behind. These gatherings are not just training, they are rituals. Lights, music, testimonials, standing ovations. In those rooms, doubt feels small. The collective energy drowns it out. And yet, outside those rooms, reality waits. Bills do not respond to affirmations. Rent does not accept vision boards. The gap between the lifestyle presented and the one lived quietly widens. Many begin to supplement their MLM activity with other work, even as they tell their teams they are all in. The contradiction grows heavier with time. Here is where the model protects itself again. Attrition is expected. People leave constantly. But the system is designed so that loss is invisible from above. One person quitting barely registers when recruitment continues elsewhere. In fact, turnover becomes part of the engine. Fresh belief replaces exhausted belief. New faces replenish the base. This constant churn is rarely acknowledged openly. Instead, focus remains on the winners. Their stories are recycled, refined, polished. They become symbols rather than individuals. Their timelines are compressed. Years of struggle are summarized in minutes. The message remains clear. It works if you work. Regulatory pressure occasionally breaks through the surface. Investigations, lawsuits, headlines questioning legitimacy. The response is always measured. Compliance teams adjust wording. Disclaimers are added. Income claims become examples, not guarantees. The structure adapts without fundamentally changing. As long as a product exists, as long as recruitment can be framed as optional, the system survives. For participants, This creates cognitive dissonance. If the business is questioned publicly, loyalty is tested privately. Leaders urge unity. Critics are framed as uninformed or malicious. The group closes ranks. Doubt becomes externalized. The system is no longer just a way to earn, it is something to defend. And still, many people do earn something. Enough to feel progress, enough to justify staying. This is the quiet brilliance of the model. It does not need widespread success. It needs partial reinforcement, occasional wins, intermittent rewards. Just enough to keep hope alive. Psychologically, this is powerful. Unpredictable rewards bind behavior more tightly than guaranteed ones. The next sale could change everything. The next recruit might be the one who explodes the network. Possibility remains perpetually just out of reach. But time has its own logic. Months turn into years. Energy wanes, relationships strain. The effort required to maintain the same level of enthusiasm grows heavier. Some begin to step back, not dramatically, but quietly. Calls missed. Messages unanswered. Activity slows. This is the moment the system reframes again. Stepping back is labeled playing small. Burnout becomes a personal failing, not a structural outcome. The model does not accommodate limits. It assumes infinite capacity, infinite optimism, infinite markets. For those who finally leave, the exit is rarely clean. There is embarrassment, shame, a sense of having fallen for something. Losses are minimized or rationalized. At least I learned. At least I grew. And often that is true. But the lesson is costly. Yet even exit does not dismantle the empire. Because while some leave, others are just arriving, drawn by the same promise, delivered in updated language, on new platforms, by faces they trust. The system continues to breathe. And as it grows larger, louder, more polished, it approaches its most revealing phase, the moment where scale exposes not just its strength, but its limits. There comes a point in every expanding system where growth no longer feels like momentum. But wait. It is subtle at first, almost imperceptible. The calls are still happening. The posts still go up. The phrases are still repeated with practiced confidence. But beneath the surface, something shifts. The energy required to keep the structure standing begins to exceed the energy it generates. This is the phase few people talk about, because it does not photograph well. It is not loud failure or dramatic collapse. It is quiet strain, a slow tightening around the edges of belief. By now, the network is vast. Names blur together. You no longer know everyone beneath you, only their numbers. Volume reports replace conversations. Success is measured less by connection and more by metrics: personal volume, group volume, rank maintenance. The language remains inspirational, but the mechanics feel increasingly corporate. The dream has grown large enough to need management. For those near the top, life has changed in undeniable ways. Income arrives regularly. Recognition follows. Invitations come in from across the world. Their role has evolved from participant to pillar. They are no longer chasing the system. The system depends on them. Their presence stabilizes entire branches beneath them. When they speak, hundreds listen. But this elevation comes with a quiet burden. They must remain visible, optimistic, certain. Doubt is a luxury they cannot afford publicly. If they falter, the tremor travels downward fast. So they learn to curate not just success, but emotion. Exhaustion is hidden. Fear is reframed as excitement. Vulnerability is shared selectively, always with a lesson attached. The pressure to perform never truly disappears, it only changes shape. Below them, the experience fragments. Some participants hover at a level that feels sustainable. They earn enough to justify the effort, enough to feel involved without overcommitting. Others oscillate brief surges of hope followed by long plateaus. And then there is the largest group, often invisible in success stories, whose earnings never meaningfully materialize. This is where the mathematics of scale become unavoidable. No matter how it is framed, a structure that rewards early positioning will always disadvantage late arrival. Markets saturate, social circles overlap. The same pitch, once novel, becomes familiar. Resistance grows not because people are cynical, but because they have already heard the promise before. Recruitment slows, but expectations do not. The system responds by intensifying training, new scripts, new strategies, new emphasis on branding oneself rather than selling anything tangible. You are encouraged to become the product. Your life, your journey, your why. And so the performance deepens. Success is no longer something you demonstrate with income, but with consistency. Posting daily, showing up visibly, sharing gratitude publicly. Even struggle becomes content, provided it ends with reassurance that everything is still working. The business model thrives here because effort continues even when returns diminish. The cost of participation remains financial, emotional, social, but the narrative insists that persistence is proof of character. To stop would mean admitting that effort was misplaced, and that admission is far heavier than most people expect. Outside the system, skepticism grows. Friends become wary. Family members ask uncomfortable questions. Media coverage shifts tone, focusing less on opportunity and more on outcomes. But inside, the response is cohesive. Critics are framed as outsiders who don't understand. Negative stories are exceptions. The system reinforces its boundaries by defining who belongs. This is how belief becomes insulated. Contradictory information is filtered out not through censorship, but through culture. People stop seeking external validation because internal affirmation feels safer. The group becomes a refuge, even as it demands more. Economically, the company remains insulated from most of this tension. Revenue continues as long as products move and participation fees are paid. Individual hardship does not threaten the core. In fact, churn becomes predictable. Models account for dropout rates. Growth projections assume loss. This is one of the most unsettling truths of the MLM empire. It is not built on everyone winning. It is built on enough people trying. At some point, many participants reach a crossroads they cannot ignore. The numbers are clear. The effort is undeniable. The gap between promise and reality no longer fits neatly into mindset explanations. This is where the story becomes deeply personal. For some, the realization arrives gently. A recalibration. They step back, reduce involvement, quietly disengage. For others, it arrives as rupture, debt accumulated, relationships strained, trust broken. The emotional aftermath can be severe, not just because of money lost, but because identity was invested. Leaving is rarely framed as liberation. It feels like exile. The community that once felt supportive grows distant. Messages go unanswered. Invitations stop. What was once constant becomes silent. The absence is loud. And yet, outside the structure, perspective begins to return. Numbers can be examined without emotion. Time can be reclaimed. Slowly, the individual separates their worth from the outcome of a system designed to favor very few. But even as individuals exit, the empire remains. Because while one story ends, another begins elsewhere. New markets open. New demographics are targeted. The language adapts again, more inclusive, more careful, more aligned with current cultural values. The structure persists by evolving its skin. What emerges from this phase is a paradox. MLM empires are both resilient and fragile. Resilient because they are decentralized, insulated from individual failure. Fragile because they rely on continuous belief in a world growing increasingly data literate and skeptical. And here, at this tension point between endurance and exposure, the story shifts once more. Because the question is no longer whether MLMs can grow, but whether they can continue to justify themselves in a world that is beginning to ask different questions about work, fairness, and value. The answer is not simple, and the final shape of the story is still unfolding. Every system that survives long enough eventually faces a reckoning, not always dramatic, not always public, but internal. For MLM empires, this reckoning arrives quietly, carried on the backs of shifting economies, changing technologies, and a growing awareness among the very people the system depends on. Work itself has changed. The old promises loyalty rewarded with stability, effort rewarded with security, have eroded across industries. In that erosion, MLMs once thrived, positioning themselves as alternatives to a broken world. But as digital literacy spreads, as people learn to read contracts more carefully and compare outcomes more openly, the same environment that once fed these empires begins to challenge them. Information moves faster now. Income disclosures circulate. Former participants speak publicly, not in anger, but in analysis. Patterns become visible. Stories that once felt isolated connect into something larger. And when patterns emerge, belief wavers. Inside MLM organizations, this pressure is felt before it is acknowledged. Language shifts again. The emphasis moves away from income and toward impact, away from financial freedom and toward personal growth. Success is increasingly defined in intangible terms: confidence gained, friendships formed, lessons learned. These are not meaningless outcomes, but they are telling substitutions. When money becomes harder to promise, meaning takes its place. For those still deeply invested, this reframing offers comfort. It allows them to reinterpret their experience without confronting its economics. But it also signals something else. The system knows it is being watched more closely now. Recruitment strategies grow more sophisticated. Pitches become softer, less explicit. The word MLM itself is avoided. The opportunity is framed as content creation, brand partnerships, wellness coaching, community building. The structure remains, but its outline blurs. This is not deception in the crude sense, it is adaptation. At the top, leaders diversify. They launch personal brands, podcasts, courses. They speak less about the company and more about mindset, entrepreneurship, abundance. Their income becomes increasingly independent of the original structure, even as that structure continues to feed them. This diversification is presented as inspiration, but it is also insulation. If the system falters, they will land elsewhere. For those below, the ground feels less stable. Rank maintenance becomes harder, growth slows. The energy required to appear successful increases. Many sense that the golden era, the time when expansion alone could carry them forward, has passed. But the system does not acknowledge eras. It exists only in the present tense, always on the verge of something new. This creates a strange temporal distortion. People are encouraged to behave as if opportunity is endless, even as evidence suggests it is narrowing. The tension between those two realities becomes exhausting. And yet, there is still belief. Always belief. Because the alternative, accepting that effort does not guarantee reward, is deeply uncomfortable. MLMs did not invent this discomfort. They simply learned how to monetize it. The broader economy offers few clean answers. Traditional employment feels fragile. Entrepreneurship feels inaccessible. Platforms promise visibility but reward only a tiny fraction. In this landscape, MLMs remain compelling not because they are fair, but because they are familiar. They offer a script, a path, a community. Even criticism becomes part of the story, framed as resistance to growth. Regulators continue their slow dance. Fines are issued, settlements reached, language adjusted. Rarely does the core model change. It doesn't need to. The legality of MLMs rests not on outcomes, but on structure. As long as the structure remains technically compliant, the human cost remains peripheral. This is where the story turns reflective. Not accusatory, not triumphant, but sober. Because the persistence of MLM empires tells us something uncomfortable about ourselves. About how deeply we want simple explanations for complex problems. About how willing we are to accept individual blame for systemic imbalance. About how hope, when left unsupported, becomes vulnerable to capture. For many who leave, time brings clarity. They see the system not as a villain, but as a mirror reflecting insecurities, aspirations, and unmet needs. This perspective does not erase loss, but it reframes it. The experience becomes a chapter rather than a verdict. For those still inside, the future is uncertain. Some will adapt, finding ways to extract value without burning out. Others will hold on until exhaustion forces a decision. The system will continue to offer answers, even when it cannot deliver outcomes. And for the companies themselves, the challenge ahead is not survival, it is legitimacy. In a world increasingly focused on transparency and equity, the question is not whether MLMs can exist, but whether they can justify the gap between promise and probability. As the noise fades and the slogans soften, what remains is a quieter inquiry. One that cannot be answered by testimonials or training calls. One that asks not how much someone earned, but how many tried and at what cost. The story is nearing its end now. Not because the system has stopped, but because understanding has caught up. In the end, the true measure of any economic system is not how loudly it celebrates its winners, but how quietly it absorbs its losses. MLM empires excel at silence. When people leave, they do so alone, carrying stories that rarely make it onto stages or into highlight reels. The system does not need to erase them. It simply moves on. What remains when the noise fades is something more difficult to quantify. The lingering question of what was promised versus what was possible. The emotional residue of having believed deeply in something that did not deliver in the way it was framed. This is not foolishness. It is humanity. Systems that rely on belief are not sustained by ignorance, but by hope. For those who rise to the very top, the experience often looks clean in retrospect. Success smooths memory. The early struggles become origin stories, proof of grit. The system is credited not just for income, but for identity. In these narratives, the structure worked because it was meant to. The countless parallel stories that ended differently fade into abstraction. But if you widen the lens far enough, a different picture emerges, one where effort clusters unevenly around reward, where timing outweighs talent, where belief is necessary but never sufficient. This unevenness is not unique to MLMs, it exists throughout modern capitalism, but MLMs compress it into a form that feels personal, immediate, and intimate. This is why the debate around these empires never fully settles. They are neither pure scams nor pure opportunities. They occupy a liminal space, legal yet controversial, empowering for some and damaging for many. To describe them honestly requires resisting simple labels. What MLMs truly sell is not product or income, but narrative control. They offer a story in which outcomes are framed as choices rather than probabilities. In that story, success is available to anyone who commits fully, and failure is evidence of insufficient alignment. This framing is powerful because it aligns perfectly with cultural myths about merit and self-determination. And yet, reality resists such clean storytelling. Probability does not care how badly you want something. Saturated markets do not open simply because belief is strong. These truths are uncomfortable, but they are also freeing. They shift the burden away from individual inadequacy and toward structural design. The future of MLM empires will not be decided by exposes or regulations alone. It will be shaped by awareness, by people asking better questions before committing time, money, and identity, by understanding that not all opportunities are equal, even when they sound inclusive. There will always be new versions of this model. New names, new products, new platforms. As long as inequality exists, as long as work feels unstable, as long as people crave agency, systems like this will reappear. They adapt not because they are brilliant, but because they are responsive to human need. The lesson, then, is not cynicism, it is literacy. Economic literacy, emotional literacy, the ability to separate hope from probability, community from obligation, identity from income. These skills are not taught in onboarding calls or motivational seminars. They are learned slowly, often painfully, through experience. For those who have lived inside MLM empires, the story does not end with failure or success. It ends with understanding, with the realization that worth is not measured by rank and effort does not always yield return. That realization, once internalized, can be grounding rather than devastating. And for those watching from the outside, this story is not a warning carved in stone. It is an invitation to look more closely at how money moves through trust, through relationships, through belief. To ask why certain promises feel so compelling, and what they reveal about the systems we already accept without question. The lights that once felt warm begin to dim. The music softens, the room empties. Somewhere, another presentation is being prepared, another message drafted, another invitation extended. The cycle continues not because people are naive, but because hope renews itself faster than caution. And so the story ends where it began. Not with numbers, but with a choice. To listen closely when opportunity whispers. To ask what is being asked in return. To remember that the most powerful business models are not always built on products or innovation, but on the oldest currency of all, belief. And that, in the end, is the business model behind MLMs.